Hello, welcome again to the MBA interview podcast video. We're happy to have you here. My name is Dr. Jeffrey Darville. I'm the MBA director here at the American University in the Emirates. I'm also assistant professor of business and leadership. And today I'm happy to be joined by Dr. Alex Jones. He has his PhD in learning with a focus, in leadership with a focus on critical thinking and leadership in higher education, master's degree of international business. And he has extensive experience in business development, nationally and internationally, worked for worldwide organizations such as Macmillan and W.H. Freeman, Worth Publishers, as well as some entrepreneurship in his background, which I greatly respect. He started his own company. He's also worked as the academic dean, chief academic officer, and director of admissions and administration in San Diego, California. And one of his most important topics that he studied and researched and uses in his teaching as well is the concept of critical thinking. This term has become all the rage in a lot of education circles. It shows up in articles in magazines and newspapers and in news programs. Often we talk about how we want to increase the critical thinking of our students, whether it's at the K through 12 level or all the way up into higher education and master's degrees. So to get us started, I'd like to find out a little bit more about Alex, his background, but especially this idea of critical thinking. So if you could define for us the term critical thinking and what it means for education.
Thank you, Jeffrey, for having me on the show. I'm really excited to start this podcast and looking forward actually to continue on much more valued topics in this industry, in this field. You actually brought the attention to the topic that is really most important, most challenging, which is critical thinking. Critical thinking, it is a required skill required by most industries across the world nowadays. It's required by most educational institutions, whether schools, colleges, higher education in general. And the recent survey shows in the United States about 33% of newly fresh graduates, they lack in the critical thinking skills. If we look at this rate, is pretty high percentage of fresh new graduates who are lacking such an important skill. And if we look at it here carefully, that leads us to the conclusion that having a college degree nowadays is just not enough. Having a college degree just opens the doors to graduate from a certain program. Now, critical thinking, actually, it is the most required skill, as I said, in the 21st century. Now, it dates back to the ancient Greeks, to the age of 2,500 years ago. The Plato, Aristotle, and the ancient Greek philosophers used a concept, a very simple concept, which is lacking nowadays, unfortunately, in a human being, which is the concept of training the mind. What is the concept of training mind? If we ask ourselves, how many times do we train our minds on a daily basis? We really neglect this aspects in our daily life, and simply because we're busy with day-to-day activities, and that's what we call it routine nowadays. Now, we have to pay attention to the fact that critical thinking is a logical, reflective process. So what do we mean by a logical, reflective process? The logical, reflective process, basically, that it needs and requires a logical mind, a reflective mind. So the logical mind interpret things from a different perspective. They look at things from different angles. They look at things and investigate it based on solid evidence, based on science. And they don't draw a conclusion just immediately, but after looking at the evidence and look at the different angles existing in many facts, they look at it here and they say, well, now we can draw the conclusion based on a solid evidence associated with a certain amount of certain evidence that we collected in the field or information. Now, the reflective minds, all the time, when you ask a question, they try to explain things with clarity. Now, clarity, it is the most important part of critical thinking. It is an essential component of critical thinking. Now, the logical mind investigates. The logical mind is basically evaluate analyze and judge things. Now, we have to be careful here between judging and drawing conclusions. So, making a judgment and drawing a conclusion, there is a fine line between them. Now, when you draw a conclusion, the conclusion usually comes after making a solid judgment. And this is part of the critical thinking skills. Now, a lot of people, they say, oh, now I made a conclusion about a certain aspect of life or a certain thing that happens on their daily life. But the reality is here, you're evaluating the things and you're judging it. But here, you're not judging it based on a valid conclusion. Before you draw that conclusion, you have to make sure you analyze, you evaluate, you look at the different aspects of it, and then you judge it based on that conclusion that is filled and rich with a lot of information and knowledge.
That's a really great point, Alex, and I'm glad that you bring this up because I think that many students and really workers, I think the World Economic Forum rated critical thinking as one of the top 10 skills that are needed in the workforce for the 21st century. So as you describe this, I'm thinking what we're trying to do is help students learn the process of critical thinking rather than the end result of making the judgments, because if you get the process right, based on additional experience in your life and the industry that you're in, you can apply this skill to any field, and you'll improve the outcomes of those decisions and the work that you're doing with your coworkers for sure.
Absolutely, and that leads me to the definition of Richard Paul. To be honest with you, that's one of the beautiful critical thinking definition that comes into mind right now. Richard Paul defines critical thinking as critical thinking is thinking about your thinking while you're thinking in order to make your thinking better. How beautiful is this definition, to be honest? Now, when we look at it here, that leads us to the realization critical thinking is a cognitive skill. And the cognitive skill is using the brain, which leads us back to what ancient Greek philosophers used to do, is using the mind and training the mind. And that is the most neglected skill nowadays that's in any human being, which is training the minds to accept other people's opinion. How many times do we accept people's opinions if we look at it carefully? Not really many often, because when somebody criticizes us, they will say, oh, wait a second, I am not accepting that. I am basically, don't think you're better than me, and so many thoughts going into our minds. But here it is. If I say something to you and you accept it from an open perspective, and the idea here is you're training your mind to accept other people's opinion.
This is a very important point as well. So often when we hear the word critical, we think of criticizing or being criticized.
Yes.
And the term critical doesn't necessarily mean you're offending somebody or you're attacking their ideas. It's the real term when we talk about a critique for a movie or a play, or if you're critiquing an article, you're doing critical analysis. So it's meant to describe the process of pulling things apart into their smaller parts and understanding, as you say, the evidence in order to build towards a valid conclusion.
You said it quite well, basically, and the idea here is if we open our minds and our hearts to accept other people, that itself is critical thinking. And most of the time, when somebody says something to us, this is what happens. If it does not have enough clarity, we just assume things. And assuming things that is based not on solid evidence is not critical thinking. It's basically assuming things without solid evidence. It definitely tells you you're not a critical thinker by itself. Now, a lot of us nowadays, you ask a person, are you good in critical thinking? Do you do critical thinking even inside a classroom, in organizations? You ask anybody, are you a good critical thinker? They say, yes, absolutely. But the reality here, ask a question that is vague question. Are they going to ask you back for clarity? Which really rarely happens nowadays. So clarity, although it's an essential component, but when we are willing to accept other people's opinion and we're willing to be criticized, and because most of the times when somebody criticizing us, we tend to take it negatively. But the reality here, maybe somebody is criticizing you, just want to make your ideas much better.
Right. Constructive, beneficial, positive.
Exactly.
Process.
Exactly.
Constructive criticism.
That is a cognitive process that's
good.
supposed to go in our minds. Yes. That's what it's supposed to do as a critical thinker.
One other area of critical thinking, both as you've defined it, but also as it's applied and used in the classroom, because again, I think we typically treat this as a skill that you can learn and grow and improve in your own life. A tool that I've seen you use very well, and I've recognized the benefits of this tool in my own life and career, as well as my role as a teacher and instructor, is the role play. And I come from a sales background doing sales training, and in sales, it's especially important to use a role play to get two people who take on either the role of the client and the salesperson, or the business manager and the customer, and they try and hold on to that role long enough to work through a particular story back and forth, playing the role and improving the skills that they have in the process. And for a negotiating class, critical thinking can be an important tool to use in the class, and role play can be a way of helping improve those skills. So can you tell us a little bit about how you've researched and seen the skill of, or the instrument, I should say, the activity and exercise of role play improve the skill of critical thinking?
Right. We have to start with the concept of negotiation and role play, and we have to explain them actually clearly in a separate way, and then we can combine them together. Now, we have to bear in mind, critical thinking, negotiation, and role play are the most required skills to all leaders in the world nowadays, whether leader, a manager, you want to call it the way that you want to call it, but these skills, the three skills, are really, really very important and required nowadays. Now, let's come to the concept of negotiation. Negotiation, whether we like it or not, is a social activity. We negotiate with each other. We negotiate with our significant others. We negotiate with our parents. We negotiate with our brothers, sisters, friends, colleagues, everywhere, co-workers. The concept itself is making us socialize, whether we agree or disagree on a certain point, that we're interacting with a person. So negotiation, as a matter of fact, is not a linear process. It's like a roller coaster. You go into the idea of like agreeing, disagreeing, agreeing, disagreeing, and everybody in the negotiation itself, we have to ask ourselves a question. Why do we negotiate? Simply because we need to reach the desired outcome that has not reached yet, or to solve a problem. Now, problem-solving skills, it is one of the required skills of critical thinking, okay? So, reaching a desired outcome, which is the goal that has to be achieved, you need to think thoroughly and critically in a critical thinking way, as a critical thinker, to reach the desired outcome. I want to achieve this in 5 years from now. I want to achieve this in 6 months from now. Now, how to make it happen is a process. So you negotiate with yourself. There is a lot of thinking going on inside of you as a person, and there is a lot of process that's going on, which is a cognitive process, again, that you're doing and you're using it all the way through. Now, negotiation can be interactive and non-interactive. So the interactive one is basically you're acting out the character. Now the non-interactive, which is you become in the silent part and basically you be the character. What is recommended usually from a thorough research done in this field is you're acting out the character, which is interactive. So in a lot of organizations, they neglect this part. It is a very wonderful and social activity. They can do it kind of like for 15 or 30 minutes break to increase the engagement, the level of engagement of their employees, whether if it is in the corporate world or even inside the classroom, to make students really socialize, get to know each other, and then in the same time, you realize that in a lot of organizations, you work in a certain department, and then there are your colleagues in a different department. You really do not know each other. And when I was a CEO in an organization, what I used to do, I don't look at it as silos, and that's the problem. Is like different departments. Hey, the sales doesn't interact with the marketing doesn't interact with the administration, and so forth. What I used to do is like I used to bring in those three departments all together, and then we used to do an interactive activity that's basically either acting out the character, whether let's say it's a sales pitch, okay, and then we involve every single person in order for you, like you behave and act. The character itself, and there is a lot of negotiation going on, a lot of criticism going on. But here, we make sure it is a positive criticism, not a negative criticism, because the matter of respect that probably is a touchy feeling to a lot of people. Now, the concept of role play basically it was found out that increases people's or individuals' behavior intellectually, socially, and eventually it increases the communication skill, increase the social skills, interpersonal skills, and also the problem-solving skills, which leads to the fact increases your critical thinking skill. Now, I'm coming back to the reality of critical thinking again. If we looked at the components of negotiation, we looked at the components of role play, all of these, it has a piece, bits and pieces of critical thinking component as a whole. When you train people to be critical thinkers, you have to train them on every single component individually, and then you make sure that they are completely familiar with the process. They train their minds on regular process, on regular daily basis, and then make sure they don't neglect it, because the moment that you stop, you neglect it. A simple example of this, if I ask you a question, Jeffrey, how did you come to work today? Tell me about the exits number and the exit names that leads you to here, how many roundabouts, how many traffic lights you have taken. And the first day, probably, if you follow the Google Map, whatever you're using, and the GPS in general, right, you're gonna follow the direction. The second day is kind of like you memorize it. The third day, the fourth time, fifth time, and the sixth time, it will become kind of like a natural habit. It's like, hey, why do I have to pay attention to those details? I really do not need to. It's kind of like I know how to get from here to here, but the moment I mention it to you, I guarantee it's like today you gotta look back. It's like, how many roundabouts? If somebody want to come into me and I tell them, it's like, I want you to come to the campus. I want you to come to the university. What do I have to explain to them? So this is what happens on daily basis. Or sometimes you change, ladies, they change their bags, or you change your purse or man's bags, whatever you want to call it, and then you forget things, and then that's what happens, quite often, and simply because you're assuming your own belongings and your own things in that bag, and you just like grab it and then here it is. Or you forget the car keys actually in your car. How many times that happened to you? Sometimes it happens, sometimes it doesn't happen, and simply because our mind is naturally not trained to think on constant basis. Our mind trained just to take it as we take things for granted, and then we know the way how to drive, we know the way that how to reach from A to B, and we don't pay attention to little bits and details. So paying attention to details is, again, one of the component, and it's an essential component of critical thinking.
Yeah, it's a great point, great point. I think it almost, even as you're describing this, I'm kind of relating this to Baumeister's idea. He wrote about ego strength, and it's basically the idea that our minds can only handle so many things throughout the day, so we have to pick and choose what we're going to focus on. In the same way, you train your mind to think critically about different topics, then you can use that skill during your workday, during the classroom, and train your mind to be able to be more efficient in the way it's thinking and come up with better results, better decisions, and better observations. This has been a really interesting conversation, Alex. I wish that we could continue, but I think we're going to wrap it up for the day. But I'm sure we'll be back again for another exciting conversation. So I want to thank you, Dr. Jones.